Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're going to get started in just a moment, but before things get underway, just to share a few details for the event today. We are recording the event, and the video from the event will be available on the Basic Science website. You can view the video from this event in a couple of weeks, as well as videos from prior events this season and previous seasons. Due to the large number of attendees, we are going to keep you muted throughout the event, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have questions or comments for any of our speakers today, we encourage you to post those in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Botchin, the Dean of Biological Sciences.
Good evening and welcome to Basic Science Lights the Way. I'm Mike Botchin and delighted to join you again for tonight's discussion. I'm really excited that we're bringing a fresh take on basic science with tonight's theme, which is the science of wellness. Wellness means a lot of different things, so we've asked three of our faculty members, Steve Murray, Dacher, Keltner, and Daniela Kaufer, to talk about the cultural, psychological, and physiological aspects of health and wellness, respectively. Evolution is a fundamental theme in the biological sciences. And I think you will grasp at the end of these talks, and I hope that this comes through very clearly, how wellness has undergone an evolution of how we think about it and how we teach it and how we investigate it. Our moderator and first speaker this evening is Steve Murray, who's a professor of physical education. Steve's interests are in wellness and the effects of physical activity on health promotion. Steve serves as the director of the physical education program and has co-led the efforts to develop a new minor on campus in health and wellness at Berkeley. We are all excited about this minor, which Steve will briefly describe to you. Once we get underway, we encourage guests to post their questions for our speakers in the chat box. While we won't get to all of the questions in 1 hour, unfortunately, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. So without further ado, over to you, Steve.
Hi, Mike. Thank you. And it's a delight for me to be here this evening with all of you, and I want to welcome you to our event. I'm excited to introduce tonight's audience to our programs in physical education here, as well as in health and wellness, our new minor, and also some of my esteemed colleagues and our work together here at UC Berkeley. Now, tonight's program is entitled The Science of Wellness, and we're going to discuss a lot of recent developments in neuroscience as well as psychology with my colleagues. Our guests tonight include two of my colleagues here at UC Berkeley, Professor Daniela Kaufer, she's a neuroscientist, and Professor Dacher Keltner, he's a psychologist. But before we get to the discussion, I want to talk to you about the history of physical education here at Berkeley, our new minor in health and wellness. And as the old adage tells us, the past is prologue, and looking at our past often gives us a pathway to the future. Now, when we talk about our past here at Berkeley, we have a distinguished past of over 150 years. And the past is prologue, and we look at our physical education program. I have some nice little historical images for you. And you can see women have been involved in physical education for many, many years here, decades, in fact, at Berkeley. And we've been co-educational and been a co-educational institution, and have been co-educational for physical education as well as health and much of our programming for much of our history. And if we look at our activities we've offered, we have a lot of different things here. We have fencing, archery over the years, and today we have a lot of dance and things of that nature. But physical training has always been a part of UC Berkeley. With its founding, with the Morrill Land-Grant Act, required military instruction. With that, physical training, or what many of our veterans out there will call the dreaded PT. So we've had all kinds of training there over the years, but a lot of it's been very enjoyable as well. Harmon Gymnasium was the very first gymnasium that was built on campus. It was either the third or fourth building on campus, depends upon which historical site we talk about. And the very first Department of Physical Culture was established in 1988 by this man, Frank Payne. He was a physician. Now, what's very interesting about physical education at this time frame, and why it's so important for us today, is that most of the physical educators in the 1800s were physicians. And the reason for this was simple. The leading causes of death at that time were communicable diseases. Now, let's go back and kind of give you a little bit of a timeline here. You all remember from the Old West, Doc Holliday. And Doc Holliday died of consumption, which is the term they use for tuberculosis, which is a communicable disease. So that gives you the time frame we're talking about here in the late 1800s. And what's very important about this from a future standpoint is physical education look at the entire physicality of the person and look at the mental aspects as well as hygiene aspects, cultural aspects, and those types of things. And what's very important about that is where our future is taking us. At around 1900, 1901, we had our very first gymnasium for women installed on campus, and it was named Hearst Hall. Now, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, our great benefactor, donated this building from her home. She had it deconstructed, brought to campus, had it reconstructed, and it was a social hall and a gymnasium for women. Now, unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in 1922. Well, her son, William Randolph Hearst, obviously said, well, I want to get a better building. So he built one out of concrete. And we have Hearst Memorial Gymnasium. Now, if you look at some of the images we have here, we have women swimming, we have women dancing here, what they called aesthetic dance at that time frame. We have women performing archery, and here's some more dance. And it's a wonderful, beautiful building. And 95 years later, we're still using it because it was made of concrete. Now, it does need some renovations and what have you, but it's still used day to day. And in fact, we have over 160 sections of courses are offered regularly each year. We enroll about 5,000 students, and much research indicates that regular physical activity helps promote our student wellness. And this has been reiterated time and time again through numerous studies. And that's the beauty behind Berkeley is during our 150-year history, we have always addressed the total individual and the total student. Now, this reminds us of a great dictum by John Locke. A sound mind in a sound body is a short but full description of a happy state in the world. Now, John Locke wrote this in his book, Some Thoughts Concerning Education. Now, he borrowed this from the ancient Roman poet Juvenal, who actually borrowed this from the ancient Greeks. So again, this concept is over 2,500 years old, but what's beautiful about this concept is it laid the foundation for health and wellness as we know it today. So health, wellness, and the mind-body connection. We have a lot of research out there that shows the mind-body connection is extremely important for health promotion, it's extremely important for our students, and it's extremely important for all of our community here at Berkeley. Now, if we look at the World Health Organization, it defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And what's so important about that is today we have a lot of research that looks at this mind-body connection. So we know it's not just avoiding disease, that we want people to flourish. We want them to thrive in their environments. And in fact, we have a few major studies that just published over the last 2 years I want to share with you. One is from the American Heart Association, and it's a complete scientific statement where they've done a review of the research articles. And this was just published in the last year and a half. And they talk about the psychological health, well-being, and what they call the mind-heart-body connection because they're trying to prevent heart disease. Now, what's so important about preventing heart disease is for the past 100 years, it's been the #1 killer of Americans, except for 3 years. And that was in 1918, 1919, 1920. And that was because of the Spanish flu pandemic and influenza. It killed millions of people, throughout the world. However, it's extremely important to understand preventing heart disease is a huge, huge thing. And the psychological factors we know today are just as important as the physiological factors for preventing heart disease. We also have school-based mind-body interventions. We have research papers on that. We have the impact of university-wide interdisciplinary mind-body skills, much of the things we're going to talk about tonight. And then we even have the Byrne framework of the mind-body medicine. And this is a huge movement in medicine. It's a huge movement in psychology and also neuroscience. And this leads me to talk a little bit about our health and wellness minor. We have this new minor on campus. It's a joint effort between the Division of Biological Sciences and the Department of Psychology, and where we're going to study the mind-body connection. It focuses on the physiological, the psychological, and the social-cultural factors affecting the human health and well-being. This is a big issue for us. It's all evidence-based. It's all grounded in research, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight, some of my colleagues' latest research. Many of our students, they choose to study health and wellness as a preparation for graduate work. We have many of our students go on, they want to go to medical school. We have a number who want to go on to get PhDs, or they want to study master's degrees. They go into public health, they go into health psychology, and we have a wide variety there. And what makes our program so interesting for these students is they have a lot of hands-on opportunities. We have internship opportunities for students. We have fieldwork opportunities for students. We also have wonderful research laboratories where they can get the research experience that they need in this area. And that's through biological sciences as well as through psychology and some of our other departments. And lastly, our students find employment in healthcare, human resources, out in education, and even in the counseling and fitness industry, as well as sport. And we have been very fortunate so far, and we just started this minor in the last year, and we already have over, I think the last thing was 22 to 25 majors, and in fact, we already had one graduate because the student already had a lot of the courses, and as soon as we designed it, she met with me, and I said, oh yes, you're very close, and we were able to get her through. So it's been a great hit so far. We think it's going to be a wonderful asset for that. Now, what I want to do is introduce you to our very first speaker tonight. Our first speaker will be my colleague, Dacher Keltner. Dacher is a professor of psychology in the Department of Psychology here at UC Berkeley. He's the founding director of the Greater Good Science Center, and his research spans social, personality, emotional, social interaction, individual differences in emotion, conflict, negotiation, and culture. He studies a lot with emotions. He does a lot with human happiness. And tonight, Dacher is going to talk to you about the psychology or the psychological aspects of wellness. And Dacher, can you tell us about your research?
What an honor to be with you. Thank you all for coming tonight. I want to talk about health and wellness the Berkeley way. What a terrific honor in this moment of launching our minor. So I think the first question that you might ask, and I certainly asked about the science of happiness, which I've been involved in for 25 years in psychology, is what is its relevance to the crises or the challenges that we face today? It is a pivotal moment in human history when you think about the climate crises, the documented rise in stress, the breakdown of community that a lot of people have been talking about, illusions, white supremacy, the flight from reason. It is a very hard time. I used to be skeptical of the science of happiness, and I used to ask the question you might be asking, which is, why wellness? Why well-being? Why happiness? In the class that I teach, the human happiness, which is a discovery course that is part of the health and wellness minor, I sum up 25 years of scientific insights, and these are just some highlights from the literature. And just take a moment to reflect on this, which is that what we know from a study of 340,000 people is that if you feel socially connected, it adds 10 years to your life expectancy. There's work at a lot of different medical schools that Stephen alluded to of practicing a little bit of gratitude actually benefits the cardiovascular profile. Empathetic leaders have more productive teams. We did a study showing that with Dante Dixon, now a professor at Michigan State, in under-resourced schools, if they can cultivate a little bit of awe, they actually are more interested in school and perform better. These principles of a healthy mind translate directly to the health and productivity of society. So what I do in my class, and what I'll give you a small taste of, is a philosophical approach to this literature, to the class, to the health and wellness minor, which is you should get deep cultural traditions that really span disciplines. You should really be grounded in cutting edge science. I'll give you a little flavor of that. And then just as importantly, you should gain practices by which you can enhance your own health and well-being, even make the world a little bit better and deal with some of the issues that we are dealing with When I teach this class and when I go out into the public, I'm teaching residents right now at Kaiser Permanente. I use this acronym, which summarizes some of the pathways to health and wellness. Breathe, be empathetic, practice some awe, practice some gratitude or reverence, and serve. And today I'd like to talk about something really at the focus of our lab right now, which is awe. And you'll see the spirit of our health and wellness here at UC Berkeley. Berkeley is an awe-inspiring university. It's where the idea of the national parks hatched. It's where a lot of the great political protests were originating. When you think about it, it is an awe-inspiring thing to think about this health and wellness minor. Awe is the feeling of being in the presence of things that are vast, that are mysterious to you, that you don't understand. We've done work with Berkeley students from around the world, about 30 different countries. We find awe on a regular basis, 2 to 3 times a week, in 8 different domains, from other people's courage to nature to music to collective movement to visual design to big ideas to spirituality to life and death. I would encourage you, if you went to Berkeley as an undergraduate or as a graduate student, enter into chat, like, what was a moment of awe when you were at Berkeley? Such a rich emotion here on campus that we're hoping to promote. So let me tell you about a few experiments and then close out about what we're doing with this in this health and wellness minor, and then more broadly. We started to do these studies of awe, very often using the awesome qualities of the Berkeley campus to discover what it does for people. This is a first study. We brought Berkeley students to stand next to this amazing T-Rex in our Museum of Paleontology. These are my 2 daughters who actually went to UC Berkeley. This is when they felt a little bit of awe towards their dad, not so today. And what we find is just being around an awe-inspiring T-Rex makes you feel more connected to your community. Here's a wonderful quote giving you the cultural richness of awe, Ralph Waldo Emerson. "In the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life. No disgrace, no calamity that nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air of the uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes." Egotism, such a problematic dimension to our lives. So we took students to the eucalyptus grove on the Berkeley campus, you may remember. They stood up and looked into the trees, or they looked up at a science building nearby, same place. And what you find is a moment of awe leads our students, to feel less entitled. They needed less money to do this study. They helped a stranger who had dropped some pens. Awe is good for your social tendencies. Remarkable research showing awe activates the vagus nerve, pictured here on the right, this mind-body nexus of nerves in your body. Awe reduces the inflammation response that is a pathway to 21st century disease. People register this in sort of this sensation pattern that involves the chills that most mammals show. There's almost nothing better for your body than finding a little moment of awe. So what we do at Berkeley, well, the health and wellness minor, its spirit is to give people tools to find awe. We took under-resourced teenagers and veterans out on the river. They rafted for a day. It gave them less stress as teenagers for a week. And then our veterans showed a 32% drop in PTSD symptoms just by getting out in nature. Our Institute of Parks here at Berkeley prescribes awe and nature to people in medical healthcare settings. We have a need today for health and wellness. The Berkeley Health and Wellness minor that Stephen leads is the best in the country. It's cutting edge. Why is that? One is there has been a precipitous rise in depression. Worldwide, these are the rises in the depression through the pandemic. You see the US has a 30 to 35% rise in depression, even more acute with young people. This is a health issue. Awe and health and wellness will be at the frontier of new sectors of our economy. This is our Surgeon General, very interested in the health and wellness research at UC Berkeley, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who says, emotional well-being is a resource within each of us that allows us to be resilient in the face of adversity. He's launched a bunch of initiatives that center upon health and wellness. We will lead the way. We are leading the way, and these are some various resources. I'll draw your attention not only to our minor, but also to a lot of things happening at UC Berkeley through the Greater Good Science Center. It's all free in the spirit of public education. I am coming to you from, this isn't my living room. I don't have velvety curtains in my living room. This is the journalism school where we put out our podcast, a couple 100,000 listeners, really promoting health and wellness in the Berkeley spirit. Thank you so much for listening to us and being part of this conversation. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Dacher. I have a few follow-up questions for you from our audience. One is, why were you initially skeptical about studying happiness scientifically?
Yeah, 30 years ago, research, Daniela wasn't alive yet, but we knew a lot about how stress hurt the body, hurt your cells. And the idea that gratitude or awe would be just as good for your health just wasn't on the scientific map. And I had a default assumption that it's just important to study suffering, like a lot of people, and it is. But now we're learning through these new mind-body discoveries that it's just as important to study compassion and breathing and exercise and awe as pathways to physical health. So it was just a misconception that I think we are shedding today.
Yeah, I'd have to share very similar things in my graduate work, and as being a professor for 25 years, I came happiness and through health and wellness from a physical standpoint. And then once I really got into the literature, I realized the psychological component is equally, if not more, valuable. I mean, they're equally valuable, but I had a similar thing. I just didn't realize the impact. So we have a couple more questions. Let me jump in here. Which of the 8 wonders of life do you find most awe-inspiring?
Oh, and I would ask our audience to write in, like, what wonder of life did they find at Berkeley? For me, it's nature, and Berkeley is such a promoter of natural health. I love big ideas. We're all scientists. I'm still amazed at human evolution, that billions of adaptations created the world we live in today. And I would say the moral beauty of Berkeley undergrads and graduate students, they astonish me, who these human beings are, and give me goosebumps just thinking about, Michael Machette was a young guy who was homeless, got back onto the right track, took care of his schizophrenic brother, got to Berkeley, was a veteran, person of color, honors student, and now is at UCLA Law School. That's the Berkeley health and wellness way, right? To be part of that transformation. So I would say moral beauty of other people. Oh,
absolutely. That's just wonderful. And it's great to see our students succeed. And we really love to play even a minor role in that. That's wonderful. A couple other little questions we have. What really brought you into this work? If you could just define one thing, what truly brought you into being one of the world's best social psychologists? What really inspired you?
I don't know. I feel, I was raised by a literature professor at Cal State Sacramento, and my dad was an artist, and I love the humanities, but I didn't have skills in them. And I felt like science could teach us new things and make the world a little better, which I think it is. I think the health and wellness minor is going to change technology and healthcare and education. It already is. So just the urge to use knowledge to make things a little better.
Oh, well, thank you, Dacher. Let me go ahead. We're going to go to our next speaker, and let me introduce her. Daniela Kaufer is a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology and at the Helen Wills Neuroscience Institute here at UC Berkeley. Her research spans neuroscience, aging, dementia, stress, neural stem cells, traumatic brain injuries, and more. And as if that's not enough, she's pretty impressive. Today, she will be presenting on her discovery of important new mechanisms of the resilience in the brain And Daniela, please tell us about your research.
Thank you, Steve. Absolutely a pleasure to be here tonight again and share this with you all. I'm going to start by sharing my slides. There we go. I'm going to ask you guys to close your eyes for just a second and see what is the first word that comes in your mind when you think about stress. I'm taking you all the way from Dacher's awe to stress. What's the first word for you? Okay, now that you have your word, I want you to take out your cell phones and scan this QR code that you see here. And it'll take you to a website. And when we get to this website, you will be asked to type in your word. And then we'll build a word cloud from the words that you put in. Okay, so do you have the QR code? You scanned it? There we go. And now start putting your words in. You see their anxiety and pressure. Writing, that's a stressful one for me as well. Breathing, grocery, ice cream, heart rate, compression, children, money, yep. Climate, frazzled. Great. Yep. Lots of stress in our world. So if you're asking yourself, what do Berkeley undergrads say stress is for them? I did the exact same exercise in my class, and this is what came up. So you'll see some of it is very similar things, and some of it is school and grades and midterms and family and work perspective, and sleep. Sleep is a big one for them. I hear that a lot. My research career was initially dedicated to study the effects of stress on the brain. Our brain has a remarkable capability to change with experiences, and it could be stress or it could be learning. So all of those will be experience-dependent plasticity. When I think about my own teaching and research efforts, I can identify experience-dependent plasticity throughout my whole career. A very short stint that I did in medical school, for example, left me with a passion for translational neuroscience research. And my own fascination with meditation and mindfulness brought me to think about the role of brain plasticity, not just in disease states, but in well-being. And then my students and my lab in integrative biology really brought in for me the perspective of thinking about human health through the lens of evolution. And that affected both my research and my teaching. So I teach at Berkeley a couple of undergraduate courses. One is the neurobiology of stress and resilience, and another one is a practical toolkit to freshmen, so that I can try to give our students both the understanding of the science behind resilience, but also the tools to bring it to their own lives. And then somewhere mid-career, I was very fortunate through some instant good karma that I must have done to be invited to teach neuroscience to Tibetan monks in India. It was a 6-year program by the Dalai Lama in Emory University. And this experience and the dialogue that came with that on the intersection of how we as scientists see the world and how they as people that spend their whole life answering the same questions through contemplative studies deeply affected how I teach back here at the campus, and how I run my research. And those are just some pictures from over the years when I taught there. And then my lab here at Berkeley has absolutely amazing group of graduate students, postdocs, undergraduates. You can check out our webpage and see more stuff that I am not able to talk about today. But I want to tell you today one of the aspects of what we're doing. And over the years, I've really come to think that the real answers lie beyond the group effects. It's not just if I look at a control group or a stress group, but actually the variability has the real answers. So what do I mean by that? I mean, how come some individuals recover very well from traumatic brain injury and others will be left with devastating neurological complications for the rest of their lives? Some individuals come out of exposure to stress thriving, others are left with anxiety or depression or PTSD. Steve mentioned we look at aging. How come some brains age remarkably well and others are really vulnerable to cognitive decline? And this inter-individual variation in plasticity became the main driver of what we're looking in our research. One of our first steps in that direction was figuring out molecular and physiological details. And the finding itself is something that you may already intuitively know. That is that short exposure to moderate amounts of stress could be beneficial. So I mean by that, there is an optimal level of stress that actually improves our performance. It needs to be perceived within our coping abilities. It needs to motivate and focus energy and protect us against future stressors, but it's not always bad. A graduate student in my lab, Liz Kirby, led a team some years ago that discovered that exposure to moderate stress in rats and mice through activation of the amygdala network and secretion of some local growth factors from cells that are called astrocytes increase the production of newborn neurons in the hippocampus. Those cells then are integrated to the fear circuitry and protect the brain in the case of future stressful exposure and allow those rodents to respond better in the next exposure. So that was one mechanism, one translating mechanism from molecules to cells to systems to see how stress might be beneficial. Another thing that exposure led to is a regulation of a hormone I'm sure you heard about, oxytocin, and the receptors for that hormone. So this is the very well-known affiliative love hormone, prosocial hormone, and it drove the rodents to huddle with their cage mates to reduce their aggression and to increase their resource sharing. What it does, interestingly, is that the stress itself then causes the increase in the hormone, causing the animals to behaviors that provide a supportive social environment that helps them recover from the stress. And this work was led by an undergraduate student in my lab, Sandra Moroy. So Dacher was just talking about the very amazing undergraduates that you have. This is an undergraduate that had a thesis that was published in a high impact paper. And then in collaboration with Dacher, we had a joint postdoc in Balbenami Bartal, and she developed a system that let her study empathy in rats. So I bet you that's not something that you think about in your day-to-day, empathy in rats. But Inbal discovered that rats help in-group but not out-group members by releasing them from a restrainer. So you see here the restrainer. It takes a lot of work. It takes about 40 minutes of work for this rat to learn how to release the other one, but it'll do that for an in-group but not for an out-group member. And we were then able to ask about the neuroscience behind it and discover that the behavior depends on activation of reward and social memory circuits. But very interestingly, the behavior also depended on activation of a mild stress response for the helper. You might think about it as they need to feel the pain to be compelled to help, because if the helper didn't have a stress response themselves, they weren't able to help, or they weren't motivated to help. And a bit there that I really want to share because I find it so optimistic is that recently we found that this prosocial helping behavior is innate in young animals, and they do not show the group bias. So young animals, before they learn the world, they help both in-group and out-group. Now, in contrast to that, when stress exposure is too long, like chronic stress, or maybe too severe, the opposite thing happens. Oxytocin expression is decreased, and we see increase in aggression. Production of newborn neurons in the hippocampus is halted. There's dysregulation of myelin production in different brain areas. And it's interesting to note that even in rodent models, where those animals are genetically identical and they pretty much have the same life history, we still find that some animals are resilient and others are vulnerable. We see different brain areas that are affected in different individuals, and this is predictive of the symptoms that they develop. So we could look at the brain and predict whether the symptoms that the vulnerable ones will develop will be avoidance or fear, social withdrawal, sometimes startle. So we asked ourselves about mechanisms that underlie this. And to do that, we set up an experiment where we tested the expression of genes across the full genome. We did deep phenotyping of animals, and we chose the animals that show low anxiety and high anxiety on a composite score, and then looked at the gene expression, the full gene expression of them, the full transcriptome, and try to identify changes that are specific to low anxiety, high anxiety, or in response when we compare them to the control one. And the most striking result to me was that the biggest modification of gene expression was in the group of resilient animals. So this is the group that we're calling non-affected or non-responders. And this is because they don't appear to be affected or to respond on the behavioral level. But turns out that for them to appear non-affected on the behavioral level, there has to be a major protective response on the genomic level. So resilience is actually a very active process for those animals. So we've learned that resilience is an innate trait, and you can ask me about genomic and epigenetic factors that we know are part of that. But it's also plastic, and we know that many factors can actually promote resilience. So things like physical activity, appraisal of the stress response, supportive social interactions, pro-social behavior. In us, we will call it empathy, compassion, or kindness, activation of reward circuitry, awe. All of those things will increase resilience. So there's a lot that we can do to change our own set point. So I'm going to leave you with an imagery of what I do for my own well-being. And then I invite you to create your own list of what resilience is for you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Daniela. I have obviously a bunch of questions here from our audience, so let me get to some of these. One person wants to know, how did your teaching at Berkeley change after your experience teaching neuroscience to the Buddhist monks?
So a lot of things changed for me. One, as I said, is sort of just the understanding that you can understand the world from a lot of different perspectives. And it really enriched how I do science, but thinking about how people do it from a contemplative place. The other thing is, it's very interesting to teach Tibetan monks because they're super smart people who spent their whole life learning and thinking analytically, but they've never been exposed to science. So imagine that you have to teach, but I can't show graphs that I usually show because they don't know how to read graphs. And I can't say 50% of something because they don't know percentage. And a lot of things that I take for granted, ion channel. I say ion channel, and I'm going to assume that all of you guys know what are ion channels, but they don't. So you can't fudge. You have to teach them critically, but in a way that doesn't use previous knowledge. And it very, very dramatically changed, and I think improved. I want to think improved the way that I teach on campus as well.
Oh. That's very interesting. I can only imagine the difficulties there when you don't have common background or common experiences at times to discuss with them. But that makes you really think for our undergraduate population, especially. That's really a neat thing that probably really helped. Okay, we have a couple of other questions here. Has your meditation practice contributed to any scientific insights for you?
Interesting question. My meditation practice definitely contributed to my well-being and being able to sustain stress in my own life. And with that, it helped thinking about science. But I think it made me think a lot more about well-being and resilience, and not just disease and pathology. Because very much as Dacher said, I mean, I also started my career with a focus on extreme focus on sickness and on pathology, and that's how we understand the brain. We see when it doesn't work, and then we try to fix it. And there was very little that I thought about what the brain does when it does well. But then with hours of meditation, you do sit there in mindfulness, especially, and sort of watch your own processes and become interested in that, right? And in brain processes, in the idea that the mind wanders, but it does something. It's not just there. Stories of the mind, all of that became very interesting to me. And the links to neuroscience became very clear. So at some point in my outside life, I am teaching mindfulness, and for many years I kept it very separate. And finally, I brought them together and see that it really sits so well together. And I teach that to our undergrads as well now.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay. Oh, here's a very easy question, but it's very complex, actually. And I don't think it has a perfect answer, but I want you to answer it anyway. It is, what is the optimal level of stress? And then how can I determine it for myself?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's a question I get a lot when I talk about that, is people immediately ask, so how do you know it's the right amount, or what is the optimal level? And the good answer is it depends, right? And it's very different for different individuals. Something that will be just the right amount of stress for one person would be too much for one person and would not be enough to be for another. So we have an individual amount. Our genes determine some of that. So there's genetic component to that. There's an epigenetic component to that that is done probably during development in utero and in early life, and your life history and life story experiences. So if you were exposed to early life stress, you might be a lot more stress reactive than not. So there's a lot of things that contribute to that. And then even things like your appraisal of the situation. Do you appraise a situation right now as this is something I can cope with or not? Very benign things. How well did you sleep last night? If you didn't sleep so well, you might be less ready to cope with a stressful event. If you had a moderate stressful amount or physical exercise that builds some resilience, and then you're doing better. So it's almost impossible to say. But I do think that we have a sense that we know, right? That we know, and that we can appraise things as we can deal with them or not.
Yeah, I would probably add something to that from my own academic background is, you're getting a certain amount of stress based upon just, is life fulfilling? Is it fun? Is it exciting? I always tell people the reason why we ride roller coasters is we like to be stressed out a little bit. It makes life worth living. But at the same time, you're getting too much when your overall lifestyle is being harmed, where you're not sleeping well, where you're feeling anxious all the time. So it's really, like you said, a very individualistic thing, I would think, too. And it's very interesting to look at it from your standpoint. Okay, the questions are popping up here. We have all kinds of great ones. Do you think that humans need to feel a stress response to act pro-socially? Oh, very interesting.
I think we should ask Dacher that. Bring Dacher into the conversation.
Sure, we'll bring Dacher in. That's great, Dacher. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, and I see Mike's hand is up as well. That's a deep insight. A lot of the pro-social processes at the physiological level, oxytocin, the vagus nerve and its activation, even the chills, which is the contractions of the piloerection, the muscles around your hair follicles, those are all processes that accompany states like awe and compassion and gratitude, pro-social states. And they originated evolutionarily in humans' response to stress, right? And we responded socially via these neurophysiological pathways. And so there's this interesting intertwinement of stress and hardship and suffering, and then the better angels of humans' nature, which is compassion, gratitude, awe, and the like. So very deep relationship.
That's great. Let's bring Mike in, the dean here. Mike,
yeah, I've never done this. We've had lots of these basic science lead the way thing, and I've never used my my status here. But Jeremy Thorner asked a very interesting question. He's, of course, a molecular biologist. He does genetics, structural biology, one of our brightest faculty members on campus. And he asked Daniela this question: which I don't know the answer, and I don't know whether you have any way to respond to it. But let me read what Jeremy writes. He says, the gene changes, and I guess he's referring to the
transcriptome analysis.
This transcript, yeah, and the variation between individuals are correlation. Yeah, using genetic analysis such as the Cas9 knockouts, are any of the suspects, and this is in the rats, you can't do this in humans, actually determinant, so that they change if you knock down a certain gene expression or knock something up, do the rats become more passionate? That have more empathy or whatever.
Yeah, so those are two different experiments. This is not in the empathy experiment. Mm-hmm. This is in an experiment, in the experiment that was with anxiety. So with the experiment where we're doing the deep behavioral phenotyping of anxiety, and then we choose different groups and we sequence we do RNA sequencing on their tissue from their hippocampus and from the amygdala, from two different brain areas that are involved in the stress response. And what we see there is genome-wide changes. I have to say they're not a lot. So when we do this in other situations, when we do this on aging or traumatic brain injury, we get hundreds and hundreds of genes. Here we're getting dozens of genes, so not a lot of genes. So it might be actually amenable to what Jeremy's asking is, can we actually go in with Cas9 and change those genes and see gene by gene what the responses are? But we haven't done it yet. So this is still an open one. With the empathy, you know what the difference is interesting. If you want to change their behavior, you need to cohabitate them. So if the out group lives with the in group, or even just the same kind of rat lives with, they generalize from that for 2 weeks, they start helping the out group, which by itself, I think also means something very good for if we extrapolate from that for the human condition, it means we can grow our empathy for out groups, for people that don't look like us, by getting to know them. And the idea that in young ones, it's innately they help out group as well. It's with life that they start not helping them. And what we see in their brains is that the empathy pathway is activated both ways. So even if it's an in-group or an out-group, you get activation of the empathy pathway. The innate empathy is in the brain already. What we have is sort of inhibitory signals that tell them about social memory that says this is not in our group, even though you feel empathy, don't help. So the motivation for the helping is not there but this is done on a network analysis that we get from neural recordings.
All right, that's some really interesting information there. We have a few other questions here, and this is open to both of you. And if you made a prediction, what change in your field in the next 5 years, what do you think the biggest changes will be, and what do you hope for? Either one of you, what do you think the big changes will be in the next 5 years in your discipline?
I can say what I'm hoping for. Yeah,
sure. Let's go for that.
Yeah. So, to me, one of the big advances is in technology, right? And so we're able now to do things in neuroscience that we weren't able to do before. We could do recordings from a lot of different neurons together. We can manipulate neurons to work very specifically. I can choose a neuron. I can tell you, oh, you know what? I'm going to look at dopamine neuron that goes from the nucleus accumbens to the VTA, and I would like to silence that neuron. And we have the tools to do that now. Yeah. So we can come in with a lot of things that are not just correlations, but more manipulations. CRISPR-Cas9 was mentioned, so the idea that we could do gene editing so much easier, of course, that will add. I couldn't say, 5 years ago, yes, that's so easy. I have 12 genes that are changing. Let me create 12 transgenic animals. So I'm hoping that the technology will come in to help with that, and then that the focus on things like wellness in, in my short, but not as short as you think, Dacher, lifetime in research. I've seen a huge difference in how we think about, mind-body interactions. When I started, stress was looked at as, we were the Section Z in Society for Neuroscience. It was at the very end, it wasn't something very serious. I think now there's a very, very different way that we think about connections between that. So personally, I'm hoping we'll figure out placebo effect one day and see that it's really interesting. My lab is looking now at the effects of psychedelics. I hope that becomes mainstream in what we're looking at, that we're going to be less afraid of things that somehow are not labeled so scientific to begin with, and they'll make their way into the mainstream.
Dacher, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, I complimenting what Daniela said, I think that we have moved from understanding the benefits of these kind of abstract concepts like awe and gratitude, compassion, improve life expectancy and the like. And we're getting to neurophysiological pathways, right? So I just published a paper with Maria Monroy on the different pathways by which awe benefits mind and body. There's a paper out by Francis Kuo charting 15 different pathways by which being in nature through olfaction and tactile contact and shifts in the sense of self and activating the vagus nerve, 15 very precise pathways by which Emerson's quote of "there's nothing that nature cannot repair," as scientists, we're really starting to pinpoint that. And that not only is exciting intellectually, it just points to interesting interventions for people like veterans, and things that we can do at the health and wellness minor at UC Berkeley. So I think it's an exciting time for health and wellness, really exciting. Our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, it's a big deal. He was in public health, knew a lot about kind of the Berkeley stuff, and his legacy is going to be emotional well-being. So our healthcare system is moving in this direction, very open to meditation, nature, and so forth. So I think it's a peak time to be a part of this.
Yeah, and I'd like to also kind of answer that same question that came from our audience. I believe what's going to happen in the next 5 years, definitely we're going to look at more interdisciplinary research, and we're going to realize that the true mind-body connection is very valuable, especially from a health standpoint. And I definitely see the physicality being important, the mental aspect of individuals, the emotional wellness. I think the blending of those two and more research in those areas and how they relate, I definitely see that occurring more and having much more depth in that. I have to agree with Dacher on that. I think that's just going to be a huge movement. And I think many disciplines are going to realize that we have to work together to get optimal health for people. And there's no doubt, I think that's the biggest movement. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. They keep popping up here. We have all kinds they're sending me. Okay. Based on your research, do you have some practical tips for maintaining brain resiliency with age and minimizing dysfunction of the BBB? So this is for you, Daniela. All right.
Yes, interesting question. I didn't talk about the blood-brain barrier this time. So I can do a short short something to tell what we're talking about. So this is another part of my lab that's working on aging. And we have searched for mechanisms that kind of show a transition early in life, if possible. And we found one from young, healthy, vibrant brain to cognitively declined brain. And the way that we did that is that we took traumatic brain injury, things like concussion, and what follows that, and compared the two together. And what we found was a common pathway that we see there. And it had to do with deterioration of vascular health. So blood vessels are in our whole body, and they're very important to the brain. They give us oxygen and glucose and whatever the brain needs to function. But the brain is also very fragile and important and controlling everything else. And so it is protected in a different way. It's protected in linings of the blood vessels in the brain, the cerebrovasculature, that is called the blood-brain barrier, and it's a filtration system. It doesn't let things from the blood, like toxins that we're exposed to or viruses that we're exposed to, move into the brain. And this blood-brain barrier lets the brain act physiologically in a good way. And when it's dysfunctional, we see changes in the brain. And we were able to kind of track step by step what happens there. And in aging, it turns out that there's deterioration, as we might see in the heart. We also see in the brain deterioration of the blood-brain barrier function. And what follows that are inflammatory processes in the brain because of blood proteins that enter the brain. And with that comes cognitive decline. What are the factors that can help that? You know, this is work in progress. We don't exactly know yet, but we know that things that help vasculature help in everywhere else in the body will help that. And so that's mostly physical activity. So it is very clear that physical activity will engage healing processes of vasculature and maintenance of vasculature in a way that is more protective to the brain as well.
Is that through capillary density as well? When they exercise through that, does that help out?
So it's a good question that I don't know. I don't know if it's through the density, or other factors that are secreted. I think VEGF plays a big role there.
Great. Okay, we have one more question, then we're going to turn it over to Mike. And this one's a pretty nice question for all of us: is how do students, both undergrads and grads, fit into your research? So that's a good question for both of you, because I know you're both involved with a lot of undergraduates and graduate research. So Daniela, let's go ahead and have you answer, then we'll follow up with Dacher, then we'll turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, so undergraduates and graduate students are involved in all levels of the research. In fact, I would be bold and say it's not that they're involved, they are the research. They come to the lab. It's always a process to work out with the students and figure out what's of interest to them, but they're the one that drive at the end the projects and the research. And they almost 100% of graduate students in my lab chose to work as teams with undergraduates. And so there's always a multi-layered thing in teaching as part of that. And we have undergraduates in the lab that run projects, all the way from maybe cutting brain slices on a machine to running complete projects like the project that Sandra did on social behavior that I just showed and published that as an undergraduate, and everything in between. And then in the classes that I teach, we try as well to bring in papers, reading papers, doing some research. This year, for the first time, we have the undergraduates take a piece of their own hair, and we're going to check the hormone cortisol in it, and then they're going to analyze data and do some experiments with that.
Oh, I see. How about you, Dacher? Give us some information with your
our students are the soul of our labs and our research and our scholarship. I have a lab of 8 to 10 PhD students, a couple postdocs, 3 to 4 honors students of UC Berkeley, and then dozens of research assistants. And they invent new statistics, and they take us into new ways of measuring human goodness. And they are the dynamism of the lab. And a lot of them go on to great academic careers and grad schools and med schools and law schools and teaching and so forth. So it's the great privilege of being at Berkeley to work with them.
Well, thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Dacher. And Mike, we're going to give it back to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve. And thanks, Dacher and Daniela, for your unique perspective on health and wellness. And I just want to point out to our audience that this health and wellness program that Steve and Dacher have worked on is really unique to Berkeley. And I think that we really are at a vanguard here. And I think many of our elite research universities will catch on that this is really central for them. And Berkeley is, leading the way, and I'm very proud of that. This wasn't our faculty and moderator didn't want to blow their own horns, and I'm doing it for them because I've witnessed this, and it's been a real process to get it launched, and congratulations to you guys on doing this. Okay, so without fail, I always come away with something intriguing from these talks, and I lament the fact that we can't get to all the questions and answers and comments that have been posted. And I'm excited about science in general, and the current moments that these events give us. I'm in awe with what's going on. We have more tools and discoveries that are a reflection of where our students and research is. I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us today. I encourage you to reach out if you would like to learn more about anything we've covered. And we'll be sharing additional resources with you by email about today's topic and speakers. And a video of today's session will be available at Berkeley Science Lights the Way a week from today. We look forward to seeing many of you at our next Basic Science Lights the Way, where the topic is going to be gravitational waves on November 2nd. Until then, find some awe and stay curious, fiat lux, and go Bears. And remember Dacher's, what the acronym Go Bears means. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.